On October 24, 1992, President George Bush signed the Elwha River Ecosystem and Fisheries Restoration Act, which enabled the United States to begin proceedings for the largest dam removal in United States history, directly in the heart of Olympic National Park. More than a decade later, on September 17, 2011, the pioneer removal of the Elwha and Glines Canyon dams on the Elwha River set national precedents for shattering great barriers, both physically and figuratively, and fueled an ongoing movement for the revitalization of naturally flowing waterways across the country. Freeing the Elwha, setting the standards for breaking the nation's river barriers.
For thousands of years prior, the Elwha had carved deep into the bedrock of the Elwha Valley. During spawning seasons, the river ran red with more than 500,000 Pacific salmon that nourished and sustained the flourishing lowland forest ecosystem around them, as well as the physical, cultural, and spiritual needs of the Clallam people who inhabited the river's banks. European homesteaders arrived in the Elwha Valley in 1861. At the time, Washington's first governor, Isaac Stevens, had endeavored to relocate native peoples for a growing population of Washingtonians. In a series of treaty council negotiations with the Clallam, Twana, Chemecum, and Skokomish people, tribal leaders signed treaties resulting in the upheaval of their people onto reservation land. In 1855, Clallam chief James Balch signed agreements that would ultimately relinquish the tribe's former indigenous homelands in the Treaty of Point No Point. The tribe was ordered to move to the newly formed Skokomish Reservation over 20 miles to the south. In the eyes of the government and non-native homesteaders who wanted to stake claims to the Clallam land, the tribe had fairly surrendered ownership of their historic grounds. The federal government added the land to the public domain and opened the area for homesteading, although the majority of the Clallam people remained on their tribal homelands until they were ultimately relocated by incoming settlers.
Some 5 miles to the east of the Elwha River mouth on former tribal land, the frontier town of Port Angeles was slowly becoming one of the major economic centers on the Olympic Peninsula. Upon arrival in Port Angeles in 1890, Canadian entrepreneur and hustling businessman Thomas Aldwell saw potential in the blossoming town and the Elwha River nearby. He journaled in 1901 that the Elwha, sublime in its majestic and awe-inspiring scenery, was destined to become a mighty power for good in the hands of ingenious humanity, for the present and future generations. Within a 12-year span, he had procured the necessary resources to build the Elwha Dam and its associated reservoir. To expedite his plans, Aldwell founded the Olympic Power and Development Company, claiming that his dam would generate 50,000 kilowatts of electricity, compared to a mere 500 produced by the proposed Little River Dam. In 1914, just as Aldwell had written, the Lower Elwha Dam began transmitting electricity for residential lighting and drove up the development of a new pulp mill. The Glines Canyon Dam was completed in 1927. Although the Lower Elwha Dam and the Glines Canyon Dam provided a steady stream of electricity to the peninsula and homes, settlers effectively built over Clallam history for electricity that the reservation would not receive. The dams forever changed the face of the Olympic Peninsula and set Washington at the forefront of the national hydroelectric movement of the time period.
When you have a dam on a river, by building the dam and having the dam in place, it changes the river and it usually makes things worse.
By altering river temperature, water level, sedimentation loads, the timing, volume, and velocity of flows, and by blocking the migration of species, the dams completely changed the environment in which native flora and fauna developed. The construction of dams led to a decrease in salmon habitats by 90% in under a decade. Aldwell had constructed the Elwha Dam without alternative fish passageways, violating the Point No Point Treaty and the Protection of Food Fishes Act of Washington State as well. The act read, "Any person or persons now owning or maintaining a dam without providing a fishway or ladder shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and punished by a fine." Due to the ever-industrializing hydropower industry, Leslie Darwin, the Washington State Fish Commissioner at the time, and the Olympic Power and Development Company came up with a compromise to substitute the missing fish passageways with a fish hatchery, although it never came to fruition. The great depletion of salmon runs disrupted the traditional life for the Clallam, as salmon were not only conduits of culture and stories, but served as sustenance for the tribe and played a vital role in trade. Reparations to the Clallam people for the dam's violation made by Washington State were mere compensation, as fishing of the already diminished salmon populations was strictly monitored by the state fishery enforcements. Tribal members who fished in the off-seasons were fined and jailed for their violations. After many seasons spent at a deficit, tribes won back more sustainable fishing rights in United States versus Washington, when the Honorable George Bolt ruled to guarantee 50% of all harvestable fish on Washington rivers back to its tribal populations.
In 1973, conservationists came together in Denver, Colorado to discuss the damming of American rivers. In 1991, the fight for removal of the Elwha River's two dams began, legitimizing the case that the dams were now obsolete and unsafe.
Increasingly, is that the owner of a dam says, it's going to do all the things I need to do to offset the environmental impacts of this dam, it's actually going to cost me more than the dam is worth in terms of generating electricity.
Aldwell had failed to renew the license for the Lower Elwha Dam following a lawsuit from the Klallam tribe. This interrupted the relicensing process and provided American Rivers with good cause for the dam's removal. With the help of American Rivers Organization, environmentalists, and the Klallam people who had been outspoken opponents to the two dams since their construction, scientists and engineers sourced a final push towards the controversial removal.
Now, the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife agencies, and local Indian tribes are requesting removal of the dams. Certainly, alternative power sources can be found for the pulp mill.
Demolition of the dams began in 2011 with the use of a hydraulic hammer, gradually draining the reservoir by an average of 1.5 feet per day. When state and national legislators saw that it was possible to remove these record-breaking dams, many became receptive to other deconstruction projects, despite their high price tags, the Elwha project costing $327 million from start to finish, thus breaking the political barrier of large dam removal. The U.S. operates a total of 91,457 dams. Washington is home to 1,166 of these dams and provides a disproportionately high level of hydropower to the entire nation. By 2025, 70% of dams will be at least 50 years old, says reporter Jeremy P. Jacobs. Many of these aged dams pose significant risks to their surrounding environment, and their removal is becoming increasingly common.
It's been an extraordinary transformation to see all the vegetation return to those former lake beds, and you see kind of coming out of that, a young forest.
The river has regained its luminous teal-green color, and its channel is stabilizing. And finally, the sediment trap behind the dams has passed. Approximately 30 million tons of sediment was stored above the dams. The mass was twice the size of the Statue of Liberty and larger than a 50-story building. USGS research geologist Amy East predicted that about one-half of this sediment would flow downstream in 10 years.
But what actually happened was that 20 million tons, so 2/3 of the total amount of sediment actually moved out of the two reservoirs. And it happened in only 5 years, not 10.
Perhaps most importantly are the fish populations. Since the removal of the two dams on the Elwha, salmon populations have surged from a century-long low. Chinook salmon are now returning in droves, which have doubled since their previous 60% population decline in 1984, and biologists who study them are excited about this revived free-flowing river. To the Klallam, the river return means more than just provisions. Fish mean the return of language and a reminder of their history. Today, the Elwha is one of the country's river success stories. Running for 72 kilometers from the Olympic Mountains to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, what was once lost has now been found again for the Klallam people of the Lower Elwha and all living on the northern Olympic Peninsula. The Klallam people have a thriving culture that has been revived within the heart of the naturally flowing river. The barriers have been broken both figuratively and literally, allowing for the resurgence of the Klallam tribe, enabling Washingtonians to visit a renewed Olympic National Park, and setting the standards for the return of naturally flowing rivers via the removal of dam barriers on a national scale.